Hi, I'm Paul Mason, journalist, filmmaker, writer. I'm speaking to you from my study in my home where, like everybody else, I've been locked down for 12 weeks now according to the coronavirus rules. We in Britain have seen 60,000 excess deaths. That's the same number of people, the same number of civilians who died in the Second World War in this country, and I'm afraid it's not over. If we do get a second spike, I think our Conservative government here in Britain is very likely to say, well, this time we're not going to do lockdown, we're going to put the economy first. But what is an economy? One of the themes of my books is the way we as human beings create autonomous systems and then worship them or treat them as if they are truly autonomous from our will. The sociological term for this is we fetishize them in much the same way as religious people can create a sort of fetish object, like a religious icon. Anthropologists are always telling us about tribes that had fetish objects which they worshipped. My big problem with the way we treat the economy is that we almost treat it as a thing beyond our control, which we now have to choose to save it or to save ourselves. And I think the coronavirus crisis, which I'll come to, is simply worsening and dramatising and heightening three big crises that I've been writing about for the last 10 years. They are, we have an economic model that is broken. It doesn't work. It doesn't deliver to many people in the developed world, many people in the developing world. It just doesn't work. The second crisis, as a result of not fixing the economy, we now have a crisis of democracy. We've got declining support for democracy, declining belief in the rule of law, in human rights, universal human rights. And as I speak, that one of the results of this on the 30th of May, 31st of May 2020 is that America is on fire because of the police violence there. The third crisis is what I call a crisis of technological control. We've learned to worship the market, we've learned to obey the state, and we're now learning to obey intelligent machines, algorithms, machines which can outthink us, machines which know more about us than we know about ourselves. And in my book, Clear Bright Future, I said what was at the root of all of these crises, the economy, the state, democracy and technology, is a rising fatalism that we have learned in the last 40 years and a growing crisis of the self. The kind of social character, the typical person created by the last 40 years is now at sea. They are lost. They are lost in a deep forest and don't know what to do. Now obviously the coronavirus is going to make that worse. We've seen it dramatise all of these crises. Putting the economy first, not humans, that's what Trump is doing. Putting the state first, not humans, that is what Xi Jinping is doing, with extreme forms of social control. And coming next, we'll be asked to hand over huge amounts of our data to applications behind which sit what? Unaccountable corporations, controlled not by faceless kind of managerial bureaucrats anymore, but by the Silicon Valley types who believe they are on a mission, and their mission is to reshape the way humanity behaves. So the coronavirus is obviously, the clue is in the word novel. It is a new thing. It is a new problem for humanity, but the problems that it's impacting on are old problems, or rather they are problems that have arisen in the last 40 years. And in this talk I'm going to explain what I think the way out is, focusing primarily on the economic story and focusing on the themes of my book Post-capitalism, A Guide to Our Future, which came out in 2015. Now, it is without doubt as I speak that the ruling political elites of the world have shown imagination in the face of this crisis. You may know that when the Great Depression hit America in 1929, the government basically said, let it rip. Let it rip through the economy, liquidate everything, farmers, labour, business, banks, just let it all collapse, because that's what markets do. In 2008 we didn't do that, but we didn't act fast enough and we didn't think deeply enough about what had caused 2008. But this time governments are certainly acting. We've seen the Federal Reserve pump $2 trillion plus dollars into the world economy via America. We've seen the European Central Bank do stuff. We've even seen Germany and France try to commit to some form of joint fiscal action, which didn't happen, of course, in the euro crisis. We've seen people's wages being paid by the state, and we've seen whole industry sectors being bailed out, sometimes publicly. You'll find out later a lot of them are being bailed out secretly, quietly, states underpinning vital sectors of the economy. That does show imagination, but I'm afraid it's not imagination enough, because what I'm going to make the case for here is that what we're seeing is part of a general crisis of a thing called capitalism, and that the true act of imagination that we need in response to it is to start to think our way beyond the economy based on markets, scarcity, inequality, high carbon use, and the destruction of the environment. And that's what I mean by post-capitalism. This is the economic problem in a single graph. Here's American GDP over the last 50 odd years plotted against debt in America. So the top line is all the debts of companies and households and the American government, and the bottom line is GDP. Round about the late 70s, the two lines diverge. In other words, America, the whole American economy, businesses, households and the state, are borrowing to survive, borrowing in order to grow. And that story, because I don't want to bore you with graphs, you could show the same story throughout the developed world. In fact, the total debt to GDP ratio on the eve of the COVID crisis was 322%. So the amount of debt in the economy is 3 times the size of the world economy and a bit more. And by the end of this year, it'll go up to 342%. It is rocketing as treasuries borrow to try and save businesses and pay workers' wages. But in no textbook is a debt divergence from GDP like that sustainable, for this reason. Look, John Maynard Keynes, writing in the 1930s, said something quite profound about debt. He said money is a subtle device for linking the present to the future. And what he meant by that is the way we behave with money today always signals what we think is going to happen in a few years' time or in the middle distance. Now, if you think about, since Lehman Brothers collapsed, at the time people said, well, we're looking forward to 10 years of deleveraging. We're going to pay down the debt. We didn't pay down the debt. We borrowed about 60 trillion more since Lehman Brothers. What it's telling us, the way we're behaving with money, is telling us that we believe that in the future there's going to be a highly successful, vibrant economy, highly productive, highly wealthy, which is able to pay down that debt. And my central point is that it's not going to happen. And that the reason it's not going to happen, the primary reason, is because of the unique and specific nature of information technology. Where's the effect of computing happening in the economy? Because people say, well, it's not really raising productivity. There's not mass automation, actually. What's going on? Policymakers, above all Alan Greenspan, who was then the chairman of the Federal Reserve, came up with this idea that what's happening with information technology is it's creating hidden value. And if you're in business, you're even now, even after 20 years of this, you're still trying to capture this hidden value in the form of intangible assets or goodwill or intellectual property. But in actual fact, information technology does not create hidden value. And in fact, it does something that is quite the opposite. My argument is this, and it's based on the work of Paul Romer, the economist who published this famous paper in 1990, Endogenous Technological Change. And Romer said, look, information technology is different from all previous forms of machines. He called it instructions for making things. That's what information technology is. So if you think about a music track, it's an instruction for making a speaker sound with music, Bach's, Bach's St. Matthew Passion, whatever. It's the instructions to the speaker. And Romer said the thing about these instructions is that first, the technical term is they're non-rivalrous. Now, what does that mean? It means that suppose I have an LP, a vinyl LP of St. Matthew's Passion. If I'm playing it on my record player, you can't play it. But that's not true of a digital music track. If I'm listening to it, streaming it on Spotify, you can listen to it as well from the same file that's sitting on some server somewhere in California or the Netherlands. So that's the first thing. Information technology goods are non-rival. And this makes them very hard to put a price on, and it means as well that they're almost spontaneously not scarce. Then the second thing, they're infinitely copyable for very little outlay in terms of work, in terms of energy, in terms of actual physical mass. St. Matthew's Passion exists as a digital file, a couple of megabytes, whatever. It doesn't consume much energy. It doesn't, apart from the orchestra that played it once, it's not consuming work. Someone's looking after the server farm. There's not a lot of work goes into Spotify streaming music to all of us listening to this. Now, from this, Romer and other economists drew, I think, a quite profound conclusion that what will happen in a free competition economy, where there is competition and a market, is that the reproduction costs of quite a lot of things will suddenly start to fall. And hey presto, that is what happened. And it's not just the price of software, the price of bandwidth, the price of storage, the price of a silicon chip per gigabit. No, other real things. Their price of production and reproduction and research has also begun to fall, and in some cases exponentially. Let me show you another graph. Here is the cost of sequencing one human genome. So remember the year 2000, it would cost $100 million to sequence one person's genome, and it fell to 10 million in 7 years. And that, if you can see the graph, just follows the line of Moore's law. So because computer power doubles around 18 months, and so the ability to do this stuff using information technology follows that line. And then look what happens, kabam, it drops like a stone exponentially. This is a log scale, exponentially. So what is it now? 100 million in 2000, now around $1,000. That's what we mean by exponential change. And technology is driving this. Some people, like the Deloitte consultancy, think this is never going to stop. I don't know. All I know is it's happening. And what's the outcome of that? Well, it's very hard to create marginal profits. It's very hard. If the price of everything is collapsing, the cost of production, it's very hard for the old model of capitalism to work, especially as information goods in particular are very easy to reproduce per se. The only reason that a music track used to be 99 cents on iTunes, now it's everything you want for $9.99 a month. The only reason those two prices existed is because monopolies exist. As you know, if you've ever pirated music, the actual cost of reproduction is zero. Now, this phenomenon of exponentially falling costs of production, research and reproduction has coincided with something that's quite worrying to economics, and that is called secular stagnation. Most of the growth over the last 30 years has not been driven by productivity. Such growth that we've had has been driven by the expansion of the workforce, so into the global south, 1 billion extra workers, and also through catch-up growth. So, Turkey becomes more like Serbia, Serbia becomes more like Germany, etc. Neither catch-up growth nor the kind of workforce expansion can go on forever, and in any case it has diminishing returns for reasons we won't go into. So a large part of growth in the West has really been driven by what you saw before, borrowing and central banks printing more money, and when we hit a crisis because the economy overheats and high inequality and the banks are lending on ridiculous terms, central banks have to print more money and states have to borrow more. We're now in a cycle which we were in 2001, we went through it in 2008, we went through it with the Euro crisis 2011 to 15, and guess what? We're in another one. Now, some people think this secular stagnation is, well, what's it called by? Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary to Bill Clinton, says, well, it's primarily caused a bit by technology, so it's easier to start a business, but primarily by, we've got an aging population, people like me, age 60, we've got money and we want to save it in a safe way, so we don't want to use it to buy shares and invest in an entrepreneurial venture, we want to lend it to the government. And buy bonds, lend to the government, and so there's a glut of savings, especially coming from Asia, where people save. It's a behavioural thing. That's the theory. So the glut of savings causes profit rates to fall, interest rates to fall, and growth to stagnate. See, I don't quite buy that, because I think there is a more fundamental thing. The more fundamental thing is that technological change produces a fall in the average rate of real interest. And this was brilliantly shown in a piece of research that came out this year by a Bank of England economic historian, Harvard-based Bank of England visiting historian Paul Schmelzing. Let's have a look at his graph. I mean, Schmelzing shows that really since the time of Lorenzo de' Medici, we've seen this relentless fall in real interest rates, and provocatively, Schmelzing says, without really theorising this, it's going to go on throughout this century. So he predicts that by the by the 2030s, most rates of return on investment will go negative. Zero, in other words, is just another number, and we should just expect this. You can still make money on the differences between interest rates, but they'll all be negative. Now, surprisingly, given this secular stagnation thing is obsessing the brainy end of economic policy making, surprisingly, nobody is really prepared to discuss what this means for capitalism. And I do want to discuss that. If you look at what's happening with information technology through the lens, not a popular lens, not a widely accepted lens, but through the lens, let's say, of the labour theory of value. That is the theory held by Adam Smith, David Ricardo and Karl Marx, that the source of value is the amount of work that goes into making stuff. If you use that, then what you have to do is you have to divide every commodity into kind of two concepts. It's how useful is it, and what is its value in the market. And its value in the market is created by how much work went into it, and its usefulness is its intrinsic physical qualities. Now, if you use that lens, it's really easy to see what information technology is doing and why it does exponentially collapse the costs of reproduction. What it's doing is creating exponentially more utility, use value, for almost no work input and almost no input of raw material and energy either. And it is in that information technology's uniqueness lies. And so I, and several other theorists, say that what is driving this move towards stagnation and over-reliance on debt and fiat money printing, is not some contingent factor like we've got an elderly population or that the unions were smashed in the 1970s, although these things don't help, the fundamental thing is that technological change, in the end, runs into a barrier called capitalism. And capitalism needs for there to be a return on investment. Capitalism needs for there to be a kind of markup price. In other words, this ability of information technology to produce huge amounts of utility for almost nothing is disrupting capitalism. Now, information technology doesn't just affect the price mechanism. It also potentially does other revolutionary things. It can allow us to automate production. So for the first time we can automate faster than we create new jobs. This was the great escape clause of capitalism. Sure, technological progress destroys some jobs and places downward pressure on wages in some sectors, but there's always a new sector, there's always a new specialism. That was the whole lesson of the kind of crude Marxism of the late 19th century, which just expected capitalism to run out of dynamism, was always wrong. But again, this time it's different. We face the possibility of rapid and mass and decisive automation that could, if we wanted to, reduce the amount of work done on this planet needed to reproduce human life. The third thing that information technology does, and again in a way that no other machine has done, is produce network effects. Now, network effects should be well known in telephony. The more people on a network, the more people who own a fax, the more useful a fax is. The more people on a network, the more valuable the network is. But network effects now are being produced spontaneously and en masse by this technology. So the fact is that, and what's different about them, that there is a usefulness to knowing if I input my health details about coronavirus, as I do every day in an app, it's really useful to somebody to aggregate that data with a million other people and work out where the coronavirus is moving, who is susceptible to it, how fast is it going, where are the hotspots. There's a huge social benefit. But that social benefit is not necessarily capturable by the market. And in fact, the only reason I am really enthusiastically inputting my data is because I know right now no private commercial company can colonize that data, privatize it and take it away from the social good, the public good. This, I argue, is the natural form of information technology. In a way, my dad's generation, he went to a factory, he got paid wages, the boss made profit. My dad saw that as kind of normal. There wasn't a thing in the middle that nobody owned, but there is now. There is the network effects. They are massive, and almost the entire struggle of civil society against companies like Uber, Google, Airbnb, Amazon is about who owns and controls the network effects that we produce. The fourth and final thing I want to talk about is the democratization of knowledge. Democratization and socialization of knowledge. So if there's an app, if the COVID app is wrong, somebody finds, oh, there's a glitch in this, everybody using it can have a new version tomorrow for free with very little effort. We are able to share our insights, the famous wisdom of crowds. We're able to share quickly and easily human innovation, and human potential for innovation is more explosive than it has ever been in history. In summary, information technology is disrupting capitalism's ability to reproduce itself, its ability to adapt and morph. It is quite definitely, I would argue, behind this tendency towards stagnation, which in turn is what is behind the need to keep relying on borrowed money and printed money. That, if you want to use the word, is what you could call the endogenous crisis of capitalism. The crisis it has generated itself from the economy. But of course, we're facing two other crises that look external, exogenous. First of all, climate. If we don't decarbonise this planet by the 2050 or nearby, we will enter a feedback loop of chaotic situations. And now we've got the coronavirus pandemic, and it's not the first zoonotic virus that's crossed from animals and birds to humans. According to scientists, there are 1.5 million such viruses just waiting to cross and to mutate. We are now in a world of uncertainty about human biological security, and it's no accident. It is not really, like climate, it's not really an external or exogenous impact. It arises from the kind of capitalism we built. I mean, sure, you can imagine in a parallel universe, 250 years ago, we invent a form of capitalism that doesn't rely on carbon for energy and destroying the environment making the environment a kind of waste pipe. But that's the form of capitalism we actually invented, and we haven't ever known another one. And so the coronavirus is just the latest example of the results of a form of capitalism that always destroys the natural environment. As somebody who comes from the left, I'm acutely aware of a problem we've created for ourselves. The left had a very, very kind of relaxed attitude to time. What I mean by that is, if you think about Edward Bernstein, the theorist who invented 20th century social democracy, moderate, gradual social democracy, he basically said, look, forget socialism, forget the end goal, make slow progress, build up your forces, make slow progress within capitalism, and there's plenty of time, was the implication. And at the other end, the revolutionary end of the left, you've got people like Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg, murdered in 1919, almost the last thing she writes is, yeah, we've been defeated in the Berlin uprising, January 1919, yes, but the revolution marches to victory through a series of defeats, says Rosa Luxemburg. The implication again is, we've been defeated this time, but next time we'll learn and we can win. Martin Luther King, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But climate change foreshortens all of these projects. Climate change has to be addressed in the next 30 years, or, as the IPCC tells us, we are going to enter a world of pain that we just can't understand because of the feedback loops and the chaotic nature of the impacts on the global ecosystem. And so that entire relaxation about time, I think, has to be rethought. Of course, it wasn't just the left that was relaxed about time. The centre, liberalism, thought time had stopped with Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. We've reached the perfect form of capitalism, we've reached liberal democracy, nothing better is possible, it's going to be boring from now on, guys, is the implication of Fukuyama's essay. That's gone out the window since 2008. So we need to focus our minds on the urgent and the important. And since 2008, the urgent, important thing has been to try and move to a different economic model. And what I mean by that is a more successful and sustainable and temporary form of capitalism. I don't mean socialism, I don't mean anti-capitalism, I don't mean post-capitalism. The next task has always been to try and create a more sustainable capitalism that can defuse all the explosive kind of devices that we've created for ourselves. The climate problem, now the corona problem, and of course the banks and the kind of speculative finance system that nearly destroyed the world in 2008. But the coronavirus just refocuses all the other crises, and in a very urgent way. In the best case scenario, so we get the V-shaped recession, we find a vaccine, there's only one wave, we're still looking at, in my country, in the UK, debt to GDP going from 75% to 100, 110%. We're looking at a generation having its prospects scarred by this. But that's the best case scenario. It will only take for one of the following: no vaccine, mutation of the virus, several waves lasting into the middle of this decade, and then we're in a Great Depression. And that Great Depression will be just as traumatic, not just economically, but also geopolitically, as the 1930s were. Since 2008, central banks have been telling us, look, we, the central bank, can build a bridge from the old failed capitalism to the new capitalism, whatever that is. It's for you, the policymakers and the civil society, to come up with it. If you don't come up with it, it's just a pier. It's like it ends and we fall into the sea. And I think that we still don't know what the destination is, but the pier has to get longer. So what central banks are doing, they're printing money. They are saving entire sectors at the moment. I'm not a huge fan of state-directed economies. If you've read my book, Post-capitalism, you will know that I see the post-capitalist transition as a slow and gradual and granular one. But we are now seeing unprecedented things taking place. Let me give you a quote from a pure capitalist free market research firm, Macquarie Wealth in Australia. On March the 19th, when they saw and understood what coronavirus was going to do to us, they wrote this. This is the quote from them. "We have been arguing that capitalism is dying, or at least mutating into something that will be closer to a version of communism. This transition will be marked by cross-currents and external shocks. Ultimately, a fusion of monetary and fiscal levers will lead to MMT-style policies, modern monetary theory. Effective nationalisation of capital, universal income guarantees and deep changes in work practice." That's a mainstream investment bank telling you where they think it's going. But I'm afraid that isn't communism, it is just state capitalism facing a deep crisis. It's state capitalism on steroids, and I think that is where we are going. In the 30s, most governments turned to a form of state capitalism, protectionism, industrial planning, full employment policies as a result of the crisis, but the smart ones were the ones, and the ones that were the most successful were the ones that knew where they were going and did it enthusiastically, rather than a series of knee-jerk and kind of reluctant crisis measures. And I think that is what we are going to have to do. We are going to have to go beyond that world just described by Macquarie, but that's the baseline: state intervention, state ownership, income guarantees, and the fusion of monetary and fiscal policies towards a growth package. We need to start thinking about fusing the crisis measures into a positive offer that does the following: that it enhances human biosecurity against the viruses. That means healthcare systems, care systems, better well-being, because the comorbidities are all in the developed world the results of, well, some of them are the results of diseases of poverty. We're going to need to address climate change, decarbonise the planet, and we're going to have to invent a new kind of economy that can leverage what is good about information technology rather than letting it just drive stagnation. I'm not asking governments to embrace post-capitalism. I am asking for them to think, as they take anti-crisis measures, about using those anti-crisis measures as a long-term play into a new kind of economy. It is a no-brainer that that new kind of economy we have to design has to be beyond carbon. So if there are people long-term thrown out of work, say hairdressers or airline stewards, we don't know this yet, but if they are, then as in the 30s, at a certain point you stop paying them not to work and you start reassigning them to new sectors, rewilding forests, building solar power plants, building wind farms, building, in this country, tidal lagoons that have been put off again and again because nobody wanted to raise the capital to do them. If incomes are insecure, then actually in a developed economy like the Netherlands, like Britain, the answer isn't the universal basic income. Attractive though that is, it is universal free basic services that are much cheaper to provide because they are at scale. The third thing is, we're going to have to take a very strong line on monopolies and rent-seeking businesses. Monopolies and rent seekers suck value out of the consumer. They make the cost of living too high. They also suck value out of productive businesses, many of which will hopefully be listening to this in Eindhoven during the festival. The monopolies and rent seekers are not functional. Even mainstream economic theory says that, so we need a form of regulation that clamps down on them and in return promotes free stuff, collaboratively produced stuff, open source stuff, copyright free, Creative Commons stuff. This, I argue, should become government policy. And we need to enshrine the right of information democracy, information symmetry. Frederick Jameson, the philosopher, once said about the neoliberal era that it's become easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. But this takes a specific form now. I think it's now easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine Mark Zuckerberg actually revealing what the Facebook algorithm does. For Facebook to make money, the algorithm must be secret from us, the people who are serving it. So that's got to end. Post-capitalism proposal is quite simple. You take the open source, the peer-to-peer, the free stuff, the commons, the collectively and collaboratively produced stuff, and you grow that sector at the expense of both the state and the market over a century, long term. You change the economic model so that you are not reliant on a market which generates taxes. You are also reliant on more and more commonly produced stuff outside the market. It's a very different form of transition beyond capitalism than the one tried in the Soviet Union. It has nothing really to do with that, but it is a transition, and it will take a long time, and it could be chaotic, and it will be difficult, but it won't be as chaotic as the world we will enter in 2050 if we don't do something as radical as this. I'm often described as a technological utopian. I think what I am is somebody who says information technology makes utopian socialism possible. Small scale, gradual, individual centred, human centric, non-state centric socialism, if you want to call it that, is possible because of what information technology allows us to do. Why I think we need utopianism, however, is because of what we're up against. We've faced in the last 10 years a growing battle of three nostalgias. There's the right-wing nostalgia for an all-white America, a fortress Europe of all-white Christian Europe. That's the right-wing utopia. We've got parts of the left that have got their own nostalgic utopia. You know, back to the 50s, back to state intervention, back to a time when everybody works for one company only, and that therefore, when you have to get promotion at work, you have to wait for an old person to die. I remember even to become from second trombone to first trombone in my brass band, it would only happen when the first trombone guy retired or died. That was the world, non-meritocratic, paternalistic, hierarchical. I don't want to go back to that. And the centre is nostalgic for Blair, Clinton, Schroeder. It's nostalgic for a world that can't come back. Successful neoliberal capitalism, it's gone. We're in a battle of utopias, and if you doubt that, by the time you watch this, I think you will have seen unfolding that battle on the streets of America. The right has a utopia. It is a racist, violent world. Progressive, young people who want to see the full human potential of this species achieved and want to do it without destroying the planet or collapsing our own biosecurity, we need to think in a utopian way. And without it, we are going into the battle of this century that I'm afraid will get very scratchy and very soon without an objective. We've all been on demonstrations the last 20 years, one no and many yeses. I wrote the books, Post-capitalism and Clear Bright Future, to try and move us beyond one no and many yeses towards at least a discussion about one yes. And that yes for me is a society where the potential of information technology is no longer strangled. You know, information technology is effectively social knowledge. It is what Marx called the general intellect. It is striving to allow us to learn from each other in exponentially beneficial ways. But standing in the middle of it are the institutions, the big tech corporations and the states which stand behind them. It's as true in China, you know, with Tencent and Alibaba and Huawei as it is in America with Google, Facebook and Amazon. That's what we're up against. It's a big idea. What's the final objection? Final objection at conferences like this goes like this. Here's my 10-year tech roadmap for my company. I can see it really clearly. We're going from this to this to this. Why should I think about the outside world? When people only often at tech conferences talk about the outside world in the bar. And there won't be a bar because this is a virtual conference. But you know, they fantasize and muse about what's going to happen to the world, but they never factor it in to their business plan because it's hermetically sealed off from social, environmental, and economic, macroeconomic reality. Well, from now on, you can't seal your startup company, your cultural project. You can't seal it off. It's enmeshed in a crisis-ridden world, and I think that if we can talk to each other about what we learn from struggling against that crisis-ridden world, we'll create even more common knowledge, commonality in struggle, solidarity, and we will become social innovators. And the thing we're going to innovate is a better society than this.